in this presentation, I'm going to give you a bit of the background to this research project and some of the theoretical underpinnings from within the project around ideas of temporality and academic subjectivity. And then I'll talk you through some of the findings as well, and then there should be plenty of time for discussion and questions. The first publication from this project is forthcoming in a book on critical event studies, so look out for that, and I'm drawing on some of the work that I did for that chapter in today's presentation. And I suppose I should say that I'm an assistant professor in the Centre for Education Studies at the University of Warwick, and that the project was funded by two different kind of pots of internal funding at Warwick, Research Development Fund and the Institute for Advanced Studies. So the project background, I actually am starting to specialise in research on conferences. And part of that is actually because there is a surprising lack of research on academic conferences, particularly a lack of critical sociological research on this phenomenon. And yet the academic conference industry alone is worth billions of dollars. Nicholas Rowe, a colleague of mine working at the University of Lapland in Finland, has been looking at quantifying the academic conference industry, and it is just staggering in terms of actual finance, but also in terms of carbon footprint and also the cost on people's lives. As I've been going along, I've been discovering more research on conferences, but certainly from within the sort of higher education studies field and the sociology of education field, there's really very little. If we think about kind of adjoining research fields, there's a field of academic mobility studies looking at things like going abroad to do your doctoral degree or moving country for a job. And yet that doesn't really encompass the sort of mobility that's 1 or 2 days or 5 days that is a conference. It's a different kind of mobility, engage in life planning to do that kind of mobility. At the same time, there's work out there on work-based travel, but it focuses on regular mobility. So the point at which you might commute, say, 3 days a week, but at that point you've set up your systems. The difference with conferences is that they sort of interrupt your everyday routines, no matter who you are, really. So conferences fall between those mobility studies and the work-based travel studies. There's another kind of interesting thing about conferences, which leads to some trouble with researching this field. There's a sort of discursive contradiction where in the representations of conferences, and that, when I say representations, I mean in the way that people talk about them, the way that actually they are researched, the way they're discussed in research, and also the way in which they are displayed on social media and in cultural representations. So I don't know if any of you follow Lego Grad Student or Fergus the Cat, but there are various sort of personalities on social media who go to conferences. So the Lego Grad Student kind of goes off to conferences and various scenarios happen. So in these sorts of representations of higher education and conferences, they are quite often portrayed as being pointless, boring, and unnecessary. So went to another terrible paper, bored out of my mind, went and got drunk instead, or you know, going on holiday. Oh, it's a conference, by the way. You know, these sorts of narratives are perhaps the most common narratives that circulate about conferences. But at the same time, they are understood as well as being vital for disseminating research, for making networks, for forming collaborations. Those kinds of narratives tend to come through more in the professional development literature, the kind of academic conference or presentation skills sessions that are run at universities, and also some of the kind of blogosphere representations as well. But the risk that that I and colleagues run in researching conferences is that we say, bless you, we say that we're researching conferences, and a look of puzzlement crosses the faces of people that I tell. And once I actually start explaining what the point is, particularly of this project, then people sort of change what they think. But because so many people, these narratives are so strong, particularly the narrative of conferences being a bit silly and a bit pointless, and why do we put ourselves through it? It does actually make it quite difficult to sort of pass through that narrative and get through to some of the really important parts, which are that actually so many academic trajectories are shaped through conference participation, whether it's gaining the kind of contacts you need for giving you a reference to get a promotion or a job, whether it's actually going to a job interview, informal or formal, at a conference, or having a conversation with someone and ending up, editing a special issue with them or a book with them that then leads potentially to you having the publication that's required for your promotion or whatever. So they are extremely important spaces, but it's difficult to get through those kind of representations to actually show how important they are. Conferences are really spaces of marked inequality of access, and that is related to border politics. There quite a lot came out about that with Trump and the travel ban, that suddenly academics weren't being allowed to get through the border to get to conferences, not to mention who gets the funding to go to what, as well as whether there is even any conference funding allocated to, for example, the precariat, and whether conferences are set up for people with access requirements, and of course, caring responsibilities. So in this particular study, I decided to focus on caring responsibilities because it seemed like such a huge issue to me. And in my own, my doctoral work, which I actually researched 3 women's studies conferences, and I was looking at the knowledge production of gender at those conferences. As a kind of side narrative, my participants were constantly talking about having to miss this bit of conference in order to bridge the gap in childcare. And I just realized actually that I'm missing something in not at least doing a study specifically looking at where childcare responsibilities as well as other caring responsibilities intersect with accessing conferences. So I'm looking at access in 2 ways, and this is sort of the way that access to education is looked at in more sort of widely education literature in terms of access to and access within. So it might be that you can get through the door of a conference, that you gain access to it, but actually once you're there, what kind of access do you get within the conference? How free are you to actually participate fully in the conference? So I wanted to look at it like that because I think a lot of the existing kind of things like bursaries to assist with paying for the fees of a conference or whatever, get people through the door, but actually are they able to get what they need to out of the conference, or understand the sort of, are they able to participate in the networking, etc., that happens? So it's understanding it in those 2 ways. So my sort of actual research questions were actually, what are the specific factors of caring responsibilities that impact on both attendance at conferences and participation within? And actually, what are the strategies that academics employ to manage their caring responsibilities while they're at conferences? And that might include support from an institution or other support sources. And I was particularly interested in national versus international conferences, because international conferences, when you travel to another country to attend something, are held up as being the place that you make these international connections that are necessary for things like academic promotions, that show that you're the right kind of mobile scholar for today's academia. So I wanted to see particularly, almost to actually be able to say, look, this is what you are putting people through to expect them to do this, to say back to institutions. So the way that I'm sort of understanding this this scenario is as follows. I've said that I'm researching academics, but within that I see that as being a very broad category. So really, when I was recruiting participants for the study, I looked for self-identified academics. And in my call for participants, I very broadly stated academic, researcher, teacher in higher education, student. So really anyone who felt that they were part of academia, proto-academic, whatever. And I really wanted to include research students and people who were doing adjunct teaching, etc., within this study, because in a way, those are the people who need conferences the most and have the least kind of access to them. I interestingly was not, this study was not a study of women academics, and the call for participants nowhere stated that, but it was actually shared on social media separately by two different people as being a study of women in conferences. And I thought that was very telling, and indeed 19 of my 20 interview participants identified as women. So that is something to take into consideration for future studies. Yeah, importantly, I wanted to avoid making it about women and seeing it about care and carers. And then within that, what were the different intersecting identities that were implicated in that construction of care. So for me, the importance of bringing care and caring responsibilities into study of academia, along with quite a few other scholars, is not viewing academics as unencumbered individuals, as people who are just free without any connections, any responsibilities to move country at a drop of a hat. But instead seeing academics as nodes in a network of relationships, people that they're responsible for and who are also responsible for them. So within this study, I had also an inclusive definition of care. So I was looking for people who had children, but were also looking after potentially parents, other relatives, pets, friends, and kin. And indeed, I did have some participants who particularly felt that they should participate because, for example, they felt that having pets was really, really important part of their academic and personal identity, and that they felt that that's something that needed to be part of the study. So really, it was like a spread across different versions of care. But the theoretical underpinning I want to dwell on a little bit longer is around time and academia. I'm situating this study within common conceptualizations of time in academia today, but also trying to challenge some of those narratives a bit. So the sort of narratives that I'm talking about here is the idea that academia is speeding up in this objective kind of way, that academics have to make decisions quickly in a world which is fast moving and constantly changing. The sort of time frames that are cited in Mounts et al.'s Slow Scholarship Manifesto, referring to compressed time frames, subjects having to speed up in order to keep up. And those sorts of, do those sort of narratives ring, you know, do you feel like you're hearing those? Is that something people are sort of saying, you know, oh, got to do ever more work within smaller amounts of time, time just seems to be passing, etc. And while that, I'm not in any way denying that there's potentially more work being expected in less time, I think there's a way in which those narratives act as if time has objectively sped up. And there are ways of, I think, looking at time and subjectivity which feed into this project that I think challenge slightly that narrative. And importantly, you know, when we're talking about academics who have caring responsibilities, they are working with almost a dual set of temporalities of trying to fit in as much as possible within this sense of an academia that is already speeding up. So I'm working with three understandings of time in this study, which kind of come together as one theorization. And some of it comes from Claudia Lapping's work. I'll share the slides afterwards. They've got all the references on. But I think it's sort of important to, to step back from what time actually means in these kinds of discussions of time speeding up and it being unmanageable. So the first kind of understanding of time is what we call clock time, which is about timetables, targets, production rates, deadlines, invariable hours. This is where time doesn't stop. This is where we see time as objective, and it's almost just a given, it's external to us. And we as academic subjects just almost scrabble and try and, like, we watch the clock, we try and keep going with it. But there's a competing understanding of time that is also running alongside this, which is actually where time, we're still seen as external to it, but we try and manage it and manipulate it. So it's almost a sense that of stealing time, trading time, outsmarting time, the subjugation of time to human will. So here it's about actually seeing time as more malleable, not as fixed, as something where we can kind of overpower it and get what we need to do done. And the third understanding of time is where time and subjectivity are actually inextricably linked and produced through each other. This one is almost harder to get hold of, but it's a sense that understanding time as clock time, or understanding time as malleable and stretchable, in some ways actually impacts on the way that we understand ourselves and that we understand what we're doing. So I will return to this third version at the end and try and tell you what I think is happening to some of the subjectivities that I see through this caring responsibilities study. I think it's sort of key to think beyond this idea that time is external to us. I think we do have this almost internalized relationship with time that structures so much of what we do and how we understand things. So if we then think about these three versions of time in relation to caring responsibilities and conferences, in the first understanding of time, where time is the clock time is external to us, but we're just passively kind of running alongside it. The conference schedule is sort of like the clock time of a conference. So it's like an imperative that you have to attend around a particular timetable. It starts at this time, all the papers happen at this time, this is the break time, this is when it ends, this is what happens the next day. It's that sense of, all right, well, if that's what's happening, this is the way I need to manage my caring responsibilities in relation to this particular fixed schedule. In the second understanding of time is where the schedule is almost seen as a challenge to overcome. So how to get the most from the conference whilst not compromising on care. So this is where you're almost trying to sort of outsmart the conference schedule by almost getting what you need to from it, grabbing the best moments, and also at the same time seeing it as potentially flexible in the sense of, oh, okay, I won't go to that because I need to go and make this call. It's having this quite active relationship with that program. And in the third understanding, we can almost see that internal narrative of to what extent can I do something with the schedule, or to what extent will the schedule move with my requirements. That almost internal conversation becomes part of this ongoing academic identity, academic carer identity of how do my caring responsibilities fit in with who I am as an academic, especially if we see conferences as a point of performing a legitimate academic subjectivity. Okay, that's kind of a theoretical underpinning, and in the findings I'll return a bit more to that conceptualization. But just to give you a quick sense of what I actually did for this project. So the project had sort of three stages to it. And I designed the project around each participant going to one conference. And I had a very kind of loose definition of conference because I wanted to include people who were even, say, attending a one-day conference at their own university, because I recognize there are challenges for even if it's part of just going to your normal workplace, there are potentially challenges of having to sit in a room and not be as available as you might normally be. So that, and I particularly wanted to focus around one conference because I felt that when other studies of care in academia have asked academics kind of what are the problems you face, it becomes quite a general narrative. And what I really wanted to capture in this study was the micro detail of what was involved. So I felt that actually taking one conference for each participant and asking them to almost talk me through what they had to do in order to attend, what they did when they were attending, and what it was like when they got back, would then give me actually quite a lot of detail that I couldn't necessarily say if I said, you know, how do you find attending conferences? So before the conference, we had some contacts about what was the project about. And then when the participants then went to their conference, they had a time log to fill in, which they recorded any interactions they had with caring responsibilities or those who were looking after their caring responsibilities, or any particular thoughts that they had, you know, when suddenly a thought popped into their head, they wrote that on the time log, or sending a text or whatever it was. And then when they got back, we had an interview of around an hour where I asked more questions sort of based on that time log, and also asked them to compare that conference experience to other conferences more generally. So it gave them like a reference point from which to discuss how they find attending conferences more generally. So that was what I did, yeah, some questions that I have received previously are things like what, you know, for participants who were filling in this time log while they were there, didn't it really affect their experience of the conference? I did actually ask in the interview every single participant, how did you find the experience of recording this? Because for a lot of people, it was actually almost quite distressing, very revelatory for them, but very distressing almost to realize how many things they're juggling in their lives, and just how disrupted some people's conferences were. So it did affect people in that sense, but they didn't find that they changed their behavior at the conference due to the time log. A lot of people maybe just scribbled somewhere and then wrote up the notes afterwards, or just went back and looked through their text messages to see what they'd received. So it wasn't like people were sitting there like spending their whole conference doing this. Okay, so to give you a quick look at the just the time log, because this was quite a fascinating part of the study. It really did have a kind of all kinds of interactions on it, and provided just some wonderful points for conversation in the interview. So I'm not reading this as a kind of objective record of exactly what happened at that conference, but it was a way of sparking that conversation afterwards, and a way of capturing some of what it's like to try and participate in conferences. This is the access within part. So yeah, I recruited interview participants through my existing networks and through social media, and through some of the email lists I'm on. I had a huge response to it. I think over 60 people emailed me when I was looking for 20, and it was just clear that people were like, this has got to be researched. So in the end, I only really had the resources for 20 interviews, but I sent the time log tool to everyone else and said, if you want to fill it in, please feel free. So 9 further participants just did that and sent it to me. Most of them were UK based, but there were some international academics, and there was a real range of nationalities and mobility trajectories within that range of disciplines, but mainly attached to my kind of disciplinary networks. Yeah, generally real range of everything, and that was part of the point, was to try and capture some of the breadth of the different experiences, and to allow me to think in future, is there's a particular group, for example, that I really need to focus on in more depth. Okay, so I'll talk you through some of the findings now, if that's all right. Firstly, I've got a few kind of slides to just show you more about the sort of access to kind of aspect of things, and then I'm going to go a bit more back into the kind of temporalities side of things. So I think the first thing that is important to say is that I think some of why people look a little confused when I say I research conferences is that they think, oh, it's just a couple of days. What can it really mean? But what I found very overwhelmingly in my study is that conferences really are more than just a few days. Actually, the participants in the study think about conferences a lot, really throughout the year, because the planning process takes potentially months, weeks. So negotiating, can we do this date? Is it going to be okay? Then, you know, if something comes up a bit later, is that still okay, or are we going to have to change the arrangement, or do I not go? And it also includes a kind of bargaining of which conferences, like, oh, you know, I've already been to 2 this year, so I don't feel I can go to another one, or I missed that one, don't forget, so I definitely need to go to this one. So the conferences become this bargaining tool within the caring setup, almost, of yeah, can I go? And some of that also involves how conferences are understood by other members of the family. So are conferences understood as a holiday, a jolly? So you remember the sort of representations I talked about at the start, that some people's partners or family members were kind of, in one case, for example, someone's partner went on a holiday after she got back from the conference, because he felt, well, she had had her holiday, so he went on a bird watching holiday after that, and didn't recognize, there was no recognition there that the conference is sort of nice, but sort of actually work as well. So that ongoing bargaining really does depend partly on the understanding of what it actually means for an academic to want to go to a conference. And it also lasts weeks and months afterwards of that kind of bargaining and the negotiations. Some people were even negotiating at the conference about the next conference or about something else. So there was one participant whose elderly aunt was possibly about to pass away, and she was very, very worried that because she was at this conference, she would not be able to take the time away from her family the next weekend to go and see her aunt. And she felt quite helpless of, I'm here at this conference, I should be at home because I'd need to go and do something next weekend. So those negotiations are kind of really ongoing. But also in the week and days before leaving and the week and days after, I asked participants to say, you know, when they really felt that the conference had begun for them, and when they really felt like things had almost got back to normal. And people did so much work in preparation in terms of ordering, cooking food, making sure all the clothes were laid out, instructions, written timetables for the extracurricular activities for children or for caring instructions. And then they tended to come back and be potentially jet lagged, quite often exhausted from an intense experience, but feel that they had to take on extra duties to make up for having been away for a few days. So, I mean, it sounds a little like doom and gloom, and I need to sort of stress that for lots of participants' conferences were extremely important moments where they were themselves, spent time with friends, felt free to go out or do different things, or just felt like they could be academics. And also, it was important for some people to have that contact with home and not feel so lonely at a conference. So I'm not saying that caring responsibilities make academics' lives horrible, but I think when saying, oh, it's only a conference, I think we need to think about the fact that actually thinking about these sorts of things becomes like a big part of an academic's trajectory. So another kind of point that I want to make is about care constellations, and the fact that in very few cases was an academic's kind of caring setup simple. So even with these ones that I've put up here, when these are just the caring responsibilities that they kind of listed on the question. I had the question on the time log, which caring responsibilities are you talking about here? Whereas actually when we went into the interviews, so many other people came out of the woodwork who were either helping or needing support during that time. But just to kind of give you a sense of some of the differences between the care constellations. So the purple things are the participants. So for example, the participant 4 had almost quite a simple scenario in that she was a single parent and she took her 14-year-old with her to the conference. Thank you. So he stayed with her kind of during that, during all of that conference, accompanied her. So in some ways, she didn't need any extra support, but she did fund his international flight. In other scenarios, so participant 14 was also a single parent, and she was depending on breakfast club and after school club, so formal wraparound care. You know, in the case of her conference, they announced going to the pub kind of at lunchtime, and that excluded her from that because she couldn't kind of ring up that wraparound care and say, I'm going to be an hour late, because they don't have that hour. So that was sort of an important, when you're relying on, it was the same with participant 7, when you're relying on formal care that finishes at 5, you know, it doesn't give you flexibility that sometimes when academics, you know, do that kind of, oh, yeah, let's go down the pub, they add something on, they run over, they're not thinking necessarily about what that implication is for someone who has that formal care restriction. Then participants 5 and 15 is more complicated because the orange patches are people who are both caring responsibilities and sources of support. So in one case, there was sort of an unwell partner, and that meant that relying on the partner was kind of more difficult. The kind of plan B had to be in place. And likewise with participant 15, both her mother and partner were unwell. So it was a case of sort of lining up who else could take care if need be, etc. Sort of destabilize some of the possibilities. So it was really, people had very complicated arrangements going on in order to disrupt their routine to attend conferences. Some of this comes up in the recent report by Marie-Pierre Moreau and Murray Robertson on academics and care, that care changes over time. So sometimes, you know, someone who doesn't have caring responsibilities then has them overnight because a member of the family becomes unwell. There's an effect of academic mobility, that people who are not living in their country of origin and then don't have their family around them. And also the effect of dual career mobility. So at least one participant, actually their academic partner was away at the same time as they needed to go to the conference. So how they balanced that was kind of difficult. So a big question is it worth it? I think that comes up again and again. And there was mainly a sense that it really was worth it, which I found quite surprising from the sheer effort that people were putting into to going. So for some people, they felt like it was actually useful for their research. Some people felt there was no choice. Attending this conference is like dead or alive. And some people felt like it was a good testing ground if they were just coming back from maternity leave or from a period of caring for a relative, just about to step back into academia. Can I still do this? Yes, I can, that kind of feeling. But there was no doubt that it was a close balance. So it seemed like it was all very important, but at the same time, so much effort, you know, that it's not a clear thing that it is worth it. Okay, so if I can just, I think in terms of time, I've just got a few more slides. Okay, yeah. Okay, so those are the sort of overarching kind of almost like strong points that I want to make from this. But I just want to illustrate a bit more about my theorization of temporality and subjectivity and how this fits with this project. One of the things that really came up was sort of this idea of a balancing act between being at the conference and enacting care. So if we think about the conference clock time as involving like the start time, the session times, the break times, the transition times where you're going from one session to another, the social times, the end of the day, then there were sort of two main forms of care activities that people were balancing. So one was what I might call the checkup. You know, someone wrote on their time log, 5 text messages exchanged in mid-morning break to check everything was okay at home. This sort of thing came up a lot, that people would plan around the clock time of that gives me an opportunity to enact care, so check everything's okay, etc. But the other form of care was the unforeseen incident. And there were a lot of unforeseen incidents, which I think showed in part the fragility of people's sort of care constellations. So participant 16, the hairdresser messed up her daughter's haircut. And that kind of sounds maybe a little facile to say, but it basically led to a family conflict, because the 2 sets of grandparents were looking after her daughter at the time, and it became one of their fault, and it became like a bit of a feud. And she actually missed some conference sessions trying to mediate. Every time she went between the sessions, she was like on the phone. So that was sort of, that came up, all kinds of unforeseen incidents came up and led to bits of the conference, the sort of balance being dropped, basically. And what really came out of interest for me is what is the most important part of the conference to attend. So if we think about some of the benefits that come out of conferences, like collaborations, books, publications, networking, it tends to be from the social parts of conferences, but those were the parts that my participants were most willing to skip. When there was a checkup or an unforeseen incident, the time to deal with it was the time where other people are who don't have responsibilities are potentially making the kind of benefit and the value that that conferences are in a way for. So then there was some sense of sort of winning and losing against time, which is where we almost get into this sense of stretching time, outsmarting time, the schedule as something to get around. There was a definite sense of almost of winning, almost like, so there's a technical hitch in the session, which meant that I could check my phone and not feel guilty about it. Nothing else was happening. So that's kind of winning against time. Or, you know, a session is being presented in a language that you don't understand, able to buy a birthday present, that's a win. Or even actually being able to share the conference by social media with the family back home. So this participant took a picture of the cakes at afternoon tea time and turned it into this sort of interactive thing where she asked her child, it's afternoon tea time, which of these cakes should I have? So this is like a screenshot of her on iMessage. And that was kind of a win because it was like, oh, it's like they're here with me in a way. But at the same time, some participants felt like they kind of lost against time in that it was almost the care took over. And so in the example that I mentioned earlier of the person who had this elderly relative who may or may not be about to pass away, she felt she spent most of the conference trying to work out what was happening there, what was going to happen next weekend, like what was the point of her even being there. And there were a few participants who just felt like this has been so disrupted, I haven't been able to go to anything. Like they just felt like they'd lost. So it is again this balance, but it's whether you feel like you're manipulating the time and winning against it, or you feel like the clock time is the thing that's just out there and it's just kind of, you can't do anything about it. Okay, so I'm just going to touch quickly on the role of technology because I think this really feeds into this idea of managing time and subjectivity. I think technology should be in there as well as part of that theorization. So just some sort of quick points. I'll just put them all up there. It's very clear that technology is used as a way of being like an absent presence at home, and that it is being used by participants in a way of outsmarting clock time, so feeding into that second theorization. And that's both in relation to the checkup that I just mentioned, kind of managing that routine from a distance. So has the pickup happened, waiting for a response to see if it's happened, or that even with one participant, there was like an app on her phone that the nursery ticked off if her child had eaten his lunch. So she was checking the app to see from another country if the child had eaten the food. And this created actually a lot of anxiety when no response came. So this was quite a lot of people, when they were recording their thoughts, it was waiting for confirmation that had happened, that had gone through. But another part was around managing the unexpected. So like with the haircut, using social media or using technology in that way of actually being, in a way, seen as contactable. So people actually were sort of involved by their families back home much more than they might have been if they hadn't had access to that technology. So, you know, there was a sense of kind of checking up, knowing that something unforeseen had happened, being kept in the loop about it, ending up mediating it, this sort of thing. I came to kind of ask myself, like, what or where is a phone, particularly because it was phones, really, within this kind of, this academic caring subjectivity. And in some ways it was clear that the phone was a physical object and that people had very clear habits of like how they interact with their phone, of they know they keep it in their bag, but they check it in the break, or that they keep it on the table face down or face up, keep it in their lap, or they look around, see what other people are doing, and then do the same, this sort of thing. But actually, I think the phone is also in the mind, that actually it's experienced as this kind of constant of actually almost like waiting to check it in case there's been something. So people were sort of almost talking to me about that, even if they weren't checking it, they were wondering if there was anything on it that they should be checking. And the actual opportunity to check it was a sort of feeling of relief, but with guilt at the same time, that I shouldn't want to check it so much. So people were really in quite like intense cyclical processes about it. And then I think another way of seeing it is as a kind of almost family presence. So as I said about the afternoon tea, that is almost like in quite a creative and productive way, sharing the conference experience with family. So people would do things like have a little animal, stuffed animal that they would take pictures of in front of buildings and stuff to kind of really like bring alive the conference experience. But however you see it, whether it's in your mind or as almost having your family with you or as having it as a physical object, it felt like it was sort of inimical to this sense of being into places at once, and that sort of bargaining against time, taking these few days out, was very much part of that sense of what it is to be both an academic and a carer at the same time. I think it really hinged around the phone. So in my kind of final sum up, I guess there were sort of three ways in which I felt that time and subjectivity were being enacted and being brought into academics' understandings of themselves through these conferences. I think basically it's sort of this disjuncture between the passive and active relationship with time. So to what extent we feel that we can fight against time, or that time is just this inevitable thing that we're kind of losing against. And there was a figure of the superhuman academic time manager. I can do it all. I can do the conference. I can have my family, and it's all just fine. There was a sense of more kind of vulnerability to clock time, of a sense that if it tips over, if something goes wrong with that clock time, with the conference, that everything kind of, that is, again, the fragility that things almost kind of just can't work. And then I picked up on a sort of sense of ambivalence, resignation, almost, that that in order to be a carer of some kind and attend conferences, there's no real perfect way of doing it. Almost a sense that you kind of got to do it, but it's really hard. So it definitely did come out that I think even participants who had pretty almost small constellations. So some participants, their main caring responsibility was their partner, who wasn't necessarily ill. They just defined them as in a caring relationship. Even for them, it was really challenging trying to kind of manage this disruption, especially a disruption that is potentially seen by those around them as being a jolly or a holiday, or you know, if they come back saying it was really boring, what the hell was it all for? So there's a sense of misunderstanding around, well, it's not even misunderstanding, multiple understandings of what conferences are and what they're for, and how you then manage them. So, okay, that's pretty much all I want to say, other than to thank you for your time and attention, and to say that where I'm trying to go with this, I've kind of presented more like the thinking kind of what you might call an academic version of this project today, but I'm also preparing a sort of briefing note type document for both for higher education institutions as well as conference organisers, with actually to say to higher education institutions, you know, for some departments who actually require their members of staff to go to conferences, this, you know, what are you doing? Are you even, is it come across your radar that your staff might actually find that really difficult? And then for conference organisers, kind of what are some of the things you might be able to put in place? And offering a creche is not the answer to it. It might be something you can include, but it's not the answer. And a lot of my participants said they wouldn't use a creche. What they would really benefit from, say, is like a bursary or something to cover the existing care. So I'm also preparing a short film to try and kind of wake people up to some of these issues of the importance of thinking about this. I've got a dissemination symposium coming up on 12th of June at Warwick, and I'm sort of engaging in informal consultations whenever people will ask me or listen. So the base conference coming up, I had a Skype meeting with the committee, and they are implementing some of my recommendations. there was a stakeholder group as part of the project, which included Emily representing Cheer Centre, where I got some feedback from academic associations and experts in this area on what are some of the things that I should be looking at going forward. So yeah, that's partly happening. And there is a project mailing list and a website if you want to have a look at some of the other things that I'm doing. But I would really, I'd really recommend your, I really, appreciate your questions. I think that's all I want to say for now.